December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii Territory. 7:48 a.m. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pacific Fleet's anchorage as Commander Mitsuo Fuchida's voice crackled through his radio headset. Tora, Tora, Tora. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with the tropical breeze as 353 Japanese aircraft descended upon the sleeping American naval base. In the cockpits above, many Japanese pilots wore expressions of grim satisfaction, not merely for the tactical surprise they had achieved, but for what they believed this moment represented: the inevitable collision between Japanese resolve and American decadence. Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, leading the second wave of attackers, had spent months studying intelligence reports about American military capabilities. Like his fellow officers, he had been briefed extensively on what Imperial Navy strategists considered America's fundamental weakness: a nation grown soft through prosperity, populated by individualistic citizens who lacked the spiritual fortitude for prolonged warfare. As his Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber swept low over the harbor, Shimazaki could see the American battleships, symbols of industrial might, perhaps, but crewed by men who, according to Japanese military doctrine, would crumble when faced with true adversity. This was the prevailing wisdom within the Japanese officer corps in late 1941. America possessed impressive industrial capacity, certainly, but industrial capacity meant nothing without the warrior spirit to wield it effectively. The Japanese had studied American society through the lens of their own cultural values and found it wanting. They saw a nation obsessed with material comfort, entertainment, and individual pleasure. A nation where young men spent their evenings at baseball games and movie theaters, rather than preparing their spirits for the ultimate sacrifice of war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had lived in America and understood its industrial potential better than most of his colleagues. Yet even Yamamoto believed that American resolve would prove brittle when tested by sustained conflict. The plan was elegant in its psychological calculation: deliver such a devastating blow that the American people, accustomed to safety and abundance, would demand their governments negotiate, rather than endure the prolonged. This sentiment echoed throughout the combined fleet. Japanese officers had witnessed their own military's performance in China, where 4 years of warfare had hardened Japanese soldiers into what they considered the finest fighting force in the world. How could soft Americans, raised on hamburgers and Hollywood films, possibly match such dedication? The immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor seemed to validate these assumptions. Within hours of the attack, Japanese forces were striking across the Pacific with devastating effectiveness. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day, 1941. Manila was abandoned on January 2, 1942. Singapore, Britain's supposedly impregnable fortress, surrendered on February 15th, after what many considered a shamefully brief resistance. The Dutch East Indies collapsed by March. American and Filipino forces on Bataan and Corregidor, despite heroic resistance, ultimately succumbed to superior Japanese planning and execution. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, one of the key planners of Japan's southern operations, observed the early victories with profound satisfaction. His post-war memoirs reveal the contempt with which Japanese staff officers viewed their Western opponents. The Americans fought bravely enough as individuals, but they lacked the spiritual unity that transforms individual courage into invincible force. When their comfortable assumptions about warfare were shattered, they could not adapt as we could. For 6 months after Pearl Harbor, every major engagement seemed to confirm Japanese preconceptions about American fighting spirit. At the Battle of the Java Sea in February 1942, a combined American, British, Dutch, Australian fleet was systematically destroyed by Japanese naval forces under Admiral Takeo Takagi. The Americans lost the heavy cruiser Houston after a gallant but ultimately futile fight. exactly the kind of individualistic heroism that Japanese strategists expected from a military lacking proper spiritual foundation. Even when American forces fought with undeniable courage, Japanese officers interpreted their resistance through the lens of cultural superiority. The doomed defense of Wake Island in December 1941 impressed Japanese attackers with its tenacity, but Major Devereux's eventual surrender after 2 weeks of bombardment merely confirmed what Japanese commanders already believed. Lieutenant General Homa Masaharu, commanding Japanese forces in the Philippines, wrote to his superiors in Tokyo during the Bataan Campaign, "American soldiers show considerable tactical skill and individual bravery, but their commanders lack the will to demand ultimate sacrifice from their men. They surrender formations that could continue fighting if properly inspired. This confirms our assessment of American character." The symbolic object that Japanese officers most associated with American weakness was the elaborate field kitchen equipment they captured from defeated American units. Unlike Japanese soldiers, who subsisted on rice balls and accepted hunger as part of warrior training, American forces traveled with mobile bakeries, ice cream machines, and coffee roasters. To Japanese eyes, this represented everything wrong with American military culture: an army more concerned with comfort than combat effectiveness. Captain Rikihei Inoguchi, a staff officer with the combined fleet, noted in his diary, after examining captured American supplies on Wake Island, "They bring ice cream makers to war. How can such men defeat soldiers prepared to eat grass and die for the emperor?" The contrast seemed to validate every assumption about American decadence corrupting American fighting spirit. But the Japanese officer corps was making a fundamental error in analysis, one that would prove catastrophic as the war progressed. They correctly identified American material abundance, but completely misunderstood its relationship to American resolve. The ice cream machines and field bakeries weren't symbols of weakness. They were symbols of a nation with such overwhelming industrial capacity that it could afford to ensure its soldiers fought on full stomachs, while simultaneously outproducing the enemy by margins that Japanese planners had never contemplated. The first crack in Japanese confidence appeared during the Doolittle raid of April 18, 1942. When Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's 16 B-25 bombers struck Tokyo and other Japanese cities, the psychological impact far exceeded the material damage. Japanese officers had been assuring their own people that the homeland was invulnerable, protected by thousands of miles of ocean and the invincible combined fleet. The sight of American bombers over Tokyo shattered that assumption. More troubling for perceptive Japanese officers was what the raid revealed about American launching medium bombers from aircraft carriers was technically complex and extremely risky, the kind of operation that required not just courage, but sophisticated logistical planning and advanced technology. Captain Minoru Genda, one of the Pearl Harbor planners, privately admitted that the Doolittle raid demonstrated American innovation and determination that Japanese intelligence had underestimated. The real awakening began at Midway on June 4, 1942. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's Mobile Strike Force, the same unit that had devastated Pearl Harbor, found itself facing an American fleet that fought with tactical sophistication and strategic intelligence that Japanese commanders had not anticipated. When dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in a single morning, the psychological shock reverberated throughout the Imperial Navy. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise dive bombers, exemplified something that Japanese officers were only beginning to understand about American military culture. McCluskey had made critical navigational decisions during the battle that required not just individual courage, but calm, analytical thinking under extreme pressure. This wasn't the impulsive bravery that Japanese strategists expected from individualistic Americans. It was disciplined professionalism, backed by superior training and equipment. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, wounded during the Midway Battle, later wrote about the moment he realized Japanese assumptions about American fighting spirit had been fundamentally flawed. When I saw how quickly American damage control parties restored the Yorktown to fighting condition after our torpedo attack, I understood that we were facing not soft civilians playing at war, but professional sailors whose casual competence masked deep technical skill. The evidence of American industrial might was becoming impossible to ignore. By late 1942, American shipyards were launching Liberty ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. American aircraft factories were producing planes at rates that dwarfed Japanese manufacturing capacity. But more disturbing to Japanese officers was the realization that this industrial surge wasn't weakening American resolve. It was strengthening it. Commander Minoru Yokota, serving with the Combined Fleet Staff, noted in his diary after analyzing American production figures, "They are not choosing between military effectiveness and material comfort. They are achieving both simultaneously." The symbolic meaning of American field kitchens was beginning to shift in Japanese perception. What had once seemed like evidence of softness now appeared more ominous. An army so well supplied that it could maintain morale through material abundance, while simultaneously maintaining fighting efficiency. Japanese soldiers, meanwhile, were beginning to experience the chronic malnutrition and equipment shortages that would characterize their war experience from 1943 onward. The Guadalcanal campaign, lasting from August 1942 to February 1943, shattered the last illusions about American staying power. Japanese officers had expected that a prolonged jungle campaign would favor their supposedly superior warrior spirit over American material advantages. Instead, they discovered that American forces could match Japanese tenacity while maintaining far superior logistics and firepower. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, whose 35th Brigade was decimated during the September 1942 attacks on Henderson Field, reported to his superiors, "The Americans fight with a methodical persistence that our intelligence failed to anticipate. They do not break under pressure as we expected, and their ability to coordinate infantry, artillery, and air support suggests professional competence of the highest order." Even more troubling was American adaptability. Japanese tactics that had proven devastatingly effective in earlier campaigns were being countered and neutralized with disturbing speed. American forces were learning from their defeats and adjusting their methods accordingly, something that Japanese doctrine, with its emphasis on spiritual superiority over tactical flexibility, had not anticipated. The night battles around Guadalcanal revealed American naval officers who could match Japanese expertise in night fighting, while bringing superior radar technology and damage control procedures to bear. When the cruiser Atlanta was destroyed during the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, Japanese officers noted that her crew had fought their ship with skill and determination until the very end. Not the behavior expected from sailors supposedly corrupted by democratic individualism. Admiral Raizo Tanaka, commanding Japanese destroyer forces during the Guadalcanal campaign, wrote after the war about his growing respect for American naval competence. "Their early defeats had given us..." The transformation in Japanese perceptions accelerated dramatically in 1943, as American industrial production reached full capacity. Intelligence reports flooding into Tokyo painted a picture of American war production that Japanese planners found almost impossible to believe. In 1943 alone, American shipyards launched over 19 million tons of shipping, more than the entire Japanese merchant marine at the war's beginning. American aircraft factories produced over 85,000 military aircraft, compared to Japan's 16,000. But numbers alone didn't tell the complete story. Japanese officers were beginning to understand that American abundance wasn't undermining American resolve. It was creating a positive feedback loop that strengthened American determination. Well-fed, well-equipped American soldiers fought more effectively, which led to more victories, which strengthened civilian morale, which supported even greater industrial production. Colonel Saburo Hayashi, serving with Imperial General Headquarters, analyzed captured American documents and concluded, "We assumed that material comfort would make Americans unwilling to sacrifice for victory. Instead, their material abundance gives them confidence that sacrifice will lead to victory. This changes the entire psychological equation of the war." The symbolic power of American field kitchens was now completely inverted in Japanese thinking. What had once represented decadent weakness now symbolized terrifying strength. An enemy so resourceful that it could maintain peak fighting efficiency while providing its soldiers with luxuries that Japanese forces could barely imagine. When Japanese troops overran American positions, they found not just ice cream makers, but also portable X-ray machines, fully equipped dental clinics, and libraries of technical manuals. The Central Pacific Offensive that began in late 1943 demonstrated American military capabilities that Japanese pre-war planning had never contemplated. The assault on Tarawa in November 1943 showcased American amphibious warfare techniques that combined massive firepower, sophisticated logistics, and tactical innovation. Despite Japanese defenders fighting with fanatical courage, American forces overwhelmed prepared positions through sheer weight of men and materiel applied with professional competence. Rear Admiral K.G. Shibazaki. The speed of the American victory was less important than the methods employed. Coordinated air, sea, land operations that demonstrated American military science had evolved far beyond what Japanese intelligence had projected. Captain Kiyoshi Itabana, one of the few Japanese officers to survive Tarawa, reported, "The Americans attacked not with reckless courage, but with calculated precision. Every element of their assault was coordinated to maximize effectiveness while minimizing their own casualties. This is not the behavior of soft civilians. These are professional soldiers applying industrial methods to warfare." The Mariana Islands campaign in 1944 marked the point where Japanese laughter turned to grim recognition of impending defeat. American forces were now operating with such overwhelming material superiority that Japanese resistance, however courageous, could only delay the inevitable. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 saw Japanese carrier aviation essentially destroyed in what American pilots dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a nickname that would have seemed impossible to Japanese officers contemplating American resolve in December 1941. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese mobile fleet, witnessed the destruction of his carefully husbanded aircraft reserves and wrote, "The Americans are no longer the same enemy we faced at Pearl Harbor. They fight now with a confidence born of certain victory. And that confidence makes them more dangerous than any spiritual training could make our own pilots." The fall of Saipan in July 1944 brought American B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese home islands, fulfilling the strategic nightmare that had driven Japan to war in the first place. But more devastating than the strategic implications was the psychological revelation that American forces could sustain massive casualties, over 16,000 American dead and wounded on Saipan, without any diminishment of national resolve. General Yoshitsugu Saito, who died leading the final banzai charge on Saipan, had expected that American casualties would weaken American determination to continue the offensive. Instead, American forces immediately began preparing for even larger and more costly assaults on Guam, Tinian, and eventually the Philippines. The Americans weren't negotiating after suffering heavy casualties. They were building more ships, training more pilots, and preparing even larger offensives. The nation that Japanese officers had dismissed as too comfortable for serious warfare was systematically destroying Japanese military power while maintaining production levels that seemed almost supernatural. The liberation of the Philippines beginning in October 1944 showcased American military capabilities that bore no resemblance to the force that had been defeated at Bataan and Corregidor 3 years earlier. General Douglas MacArthur's return to Leyte demonstrated American amphibious operations on a scale that dwarfed the Normandy landings, supported by naval and air forces that could simultaneously conduct major operations across thousands of miles of ocean. Admiral Soimu Toyota, commanding the combined fleet during the Philippines campaign, made one final attempt to exploit supposed American weaknesses during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Japanese planning assumed that American naval commanders, lacking proper spiritual preparation for decisive battle, would make critical errors when faced with complex tactical situations. Instead, American admirals demonstrated tactical flexibility and strategic thinking that Japanese commanders grudgingly recognized as superior to their own. The destruction of Japanese naval aviation during the battle meant that subsequent Japanese operations would be conducted without air cover, a situation that pre-war Japanese planning had considered impossible to accept. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the center force during Leyte Gulf, later reflected on the moment he realized that Japanese assumptions about American resolve had been fundamentally mistaken. When I saw how American pilots pressed home their attacks against our battleships, flying through intense anti-aircraft fire with the same determination our own pilots had shown at Pearl Harbor, I understood that we were no longer fighting the enemy we had prepared to defeat. The final phase of the Pacific War, from early 1945 until surrender, witnessed Japanese officers confronting the complete reversal of their pre-war assumptions about American character. The assault on Iwo Jima demonstrated American willingness to sustain casualties that exceeded Japanese expectations, while maintaining tactical effectiveness that suggested profound changes in American military culture. Lieutenant General Tadamichi. But even Kuribayashi was surprised by American tactical adaptations during the battle. His letters to his wife described American infantry tactics that combined individual initiative with sophisticated coordination, exactly the opposite of the rigid individualism that Japanese doctrine had predicted would characterize American combat performance. The American soldiers adapt to our defensive preparations with speed that suggests not just good training, but intellectual flexibility, Kuribayashi wrote in February 1945. They modify their tactics based on battlefield conditions rather than adhering to predetermined doctrine. This pragmatic approach to warfare may be more effective than our spiritual methods. The final symbol of transformed Japanese perceptions came during the battle for Okinawa, where American forces demonstrated staying power that exceeded anything Japanese officers had thought possible from democratic soldiers. The campaign lasted 82 days and cost over 82,000 American casualties. Yet American resolve never wavered. Japanese officers who had expected American public opinion to force negotiations after such losses watched in dismay as American forces prepared for even larger operations against the home islands. Admiral Matome Ugaki, commanding kamikaze operations during the Okinawa campaign, noted in his diary, "American pilots fly through our special attack formations with the same casual efficiency they bring to routine operations. They have developed a professional competence that treats our most desperate measures as ordinary hazards to be managed, rather than spiritual challenges to be feared." The recurring symbol of American field kitchens had evolved throughout the war, into something Japanese officers could no longer dismiss as evidence of weakness. By 1945, when Japanese forces were reduced to eating grass and tree bark, the knowledge that American soldiers were still receiving ice cream and fresh bread had become a symbol of overwhelming American industrial and organizational superiority. Captain Atsushi Oi, serving with the Naval General Staff during the final months of the war, wrote, "We believed that material abundance would corrupt American fighting spirit. Instead, we discovered that their abundance freed them to focus entirely on military effectiveness. A well-fed army fights better than a hungry one. This should have been obvious." The atomic bombings. The United States had not only sustained a 3.5-year war across the Pacific, but had simultaneously developed the most sophisticated weapons in human history. The Manhattan Project represented exactly the kind of sustained scientific and industrial effort that Japanese strategists had believed American society incapable of maintaining. Emperor Hirohito's surrender, broadcast on August 15, 1945, acknowledged what Japanese officers had been reluctantly accepting throughout the final year of the war. The war situation has not necessarily developed to Japan's advantage, while the general trends of the world have all turned against her interests. Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is, indeed, incalculable. But the emperor's carefully diplomatic language masked the complete intellectual collapse of Japanese pre-war assumptions about American character. The nation that Japanese officers had dismissed as too comfortable for serious warfare had proven capable of unprecedented industrial mobilization, sustained military operations across multiple theaters, and the development of weapons that ended the war on American terms. Admiral Soemu Toyota, the final commander of the combined fleet, reflected after surrender on the magnitude of Japanese miscalculation. "We prepared to fight the America of 1941, a wealthy but supposedly soft nation that would negotiate rather than sacrifice. Instead, we found ourselves at war with an America that could simultaneously invade Europe and advance across the Pacific while maintaining domestic prosperity. This was not the enemy our intelligence had described." The laughter of Japanese officers contemplating American resolve in December 1941 had been replaced by grim recognition of their own strategic blindness. They had correctly identified American material abundance, but completely misunderstood its relationship to American power. What they had interpreted as evidence of weakness, the field kitchens, the ice cream makers, the comfortable assumptions about warfare, had actually been manifestations of a kind of national strength that Japanese strategic thinking had never contemplated. The final irony was that Japanese officers had been partially correct about the relationship between material abundance and fighting spirit, but they had gotten the direction of causation. Japanese austerity didn't strengthen Japanese fighting spirit. It gradually undermined Japanese effectiveness, as malnutrition and equipment shortages took their toll. In September 1945, as Japanese officers participated in surrender ceremonies across the Pacific, many reflected on the transformation of their perceptions since Pearl Harbor. The Americans accepting their surrender weren't the soft, individualistic civilians that Japanese intelligence had described. They were professional soldiers representing a nation that had proven capable of sustained effort on a scale that had rewritten the rules of modern warfare. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, surrendering his forces in the Philippines, observed the American officers accepting his sword and noted their casual competence, the same quality that Japanese forces had encountered throughout the Pacific War. These Americans carried themselves with the confidence of men representing a nation that had never doubted its eventual victory, even during the darkest days of 1942. The field kitchens that American forces brought to surrender ceremonies served as a final symbolic reminder of the Japanese miscalculation. What had once seemed like evidence of American decadence now appeared as testimony to American abundance. A nation so wealthy and well-organized that it could fight a global war while maintaining living standards that most of the world could barely imagine. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, one of the architects of Japanese expansion who had dismissed American resolve in 1941, wrote in his post-war memoirs, "We understood American machines, but not American character. We saw their abundance and assumed it meant weakness. We never considered that abundance might be the foundation of strength, that a nation wealthy enough to give its soldiers ice cream might also be wealthy enough to build 1,000 aircraft carriers." The laughter that had echoed through Japanese staff meetings in December 1941 had been the laughter of men who believed they understood their enemy, but had actually understood nothing at all. They had prepared to fight a war against American stereotypes rather than American reality. By 1945, there was no laughter left, only the bitter recognition that they had awakened a sleeping giant, whose strength they had never begun. The Americans had not sacrificed their comfort to win the war. They had won the war while preserving their comfort. This achievement would have seemed impossible to Japanese officers in 1941, but by 1945 it had become the defining characteristic of American victory. In the quiet aftermath of surrender, as Japanese officers contemplated the magnitude of their defeat, many recognized that they had been defeated not just by American machines or American numbers, but by American confidence. The unshakable belief of a free people that their way of life was worth defending and would ultimately prevail. The laughter had stopped not because Japanese officers had lost their sense of humor, but because they had finally understood the true nature of the enemy they had chosen to fight.